Good morning. Thank you all for coming. Welcome. This is going to be a very interesting conference today. Some of you, before we get to it, I'll just give you kind of a brief introduction to Venable. A lot of you in this room have either worked with us before or know people who have worked with us before. But Venable is a full-service real estate group in New York. The firm is a full-service firm, obviously, but the real estate department, I would just like to note that one of our marquee features is the fact that we are a true full-service group. So, in addition to the early stage development, zoning, land use, and you're going to hear a lot about our 421A and ICAP capabilities today. We handle all facets of transactional acquisition, sales, finance, leasing, with a very notable construction development practice. And so hopefully today you'll hear again about our 421A and affordable housing practice, but also get to meet some of the Venable folks in the room who we're sprinkled about. Dan Bernstein joined us this year. He will give you a more in-depth description of his practice, but he is one of the true specialists in New York in the field of affordable housing, and he's assembled this fine panel, which you'll hear from and about. And we hope to get you here on time at or about 9:30. A couple of just technical notes. There are, for attorneys in the room, CLE credits available, and there's a sign-in sheet up front. Also, this is being recorded, so if anyone in the room doesn't want to be on record, don't speak. Turn it over to Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming to Venable, and thank you for coming so early. We have a great panel for today's discussion, and it's going to focus on developing and preserving affordable housing in New York City, new opportunities. There are a number of new programs, new statutes, new initiatives that are in the air that we want to focus on. And the reason for that is that affordable housing is a critical topic for New York City residential developers and for the owners of existing multifamily properties. Mayor Bill de Blasio has issued a housing plan to create 80,000 new affordable units and to preserve 120,000 affordable units over a 10-year period. So residential developers and property owners, especially market rate developers, now need to understand the programs which incentivize or may even require the development or preservation of affordable housing. The goal of today's programs is to explain how market rate developers can use these programs to create successful mixed-income residential projects. Now, our panelists today are each deeply involved with the production or preservation of affordable housing in New York City and can explain the opportunities available for residential developers and for owners of multifamily properties. Louise Carroll is Assistant Commissioner at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, where she oversees the current Inclusionary housing program, which awards additional development rights for the preservation or development of permanently affordable housing. And in her position, upon its adoption, she would be overseeing the implementation of the mandatory inclusionary housing program that's been proposed and is much discussed in the city. So we'll get into that. Juan Barahona, SMJ Development, has years of experience with the development of market rate, mixed income, and affordable residential projects throughout New York City, first with HPD, then at BFC Partners, the Richmond Group, and now with SMJ Development, which is an affiliate of BFC Partners. Justin Stern of Manatus Development Group also has years of experience with New York City real estate development, including affordable housing and charter school development. He was among the first developers of affordable housing outside of Manhattan under HP's voluntary inclusionary housing program and has generated hundreds of thousands of square feet of air rights transferred into downtown Brooklyn. As we get started today, I want to introduce three main types of economic incentives available to projects which contain affordable housing, just conceptually to frame the discussion. The first is property tax exemptions and abatements, such as the 421A tax exemption, J51, you may have heard of, 420C, Article 11 of the Private Housing Finance Law, different programs that reduce the property taxes due for a particular property. Second economic incentive is zoning bonuses, additional development rights which might be available from, say, the Inclusionary housing program to allow developers to build larger residential property. And the third incentive would be subsidies in the form of cash subsidies, below market rate financing, below market rate purchase price for city-owned land, tax-exempt bonds, or low-income housing tax credits. There's a variety of different subsidy programs that could be available from city, state, or other agencies. Now, each of these economic incentives may be available for different methods of developing or preserving affordable housing, and I want to start our discussion by talking about new construction projects. There are two issues on the minds, foremost on the minds of residential developers today. The proposed mandatory inclusionary housing program, which Louise can update us about momentarily, and the 421A property tax exemption, which has been extended through the end of this year and then amended starting next year. Now, I'll just very quickly summarize about 421A and we can get into the mandatory inclusionary discussion. The future 421A program that would take effect for projects commencing in 2016 and after would require a higher percentage of units be made affordable, 25 or 30% of rental projects, of units in rental projects be made affordable at various income bands in exchange for a longer 35-year partial tax exemption. But this is an unusual quirk. When this was passed and signed into law in June, the implementation of this future 421A statute was made dependent upon whether or not the Real Estate Board of New York and the construction trades come to an agreement on construction wages for projects of more than 15 units, and that there has to be such an agreement by January 15th, or else it is not. The latest information I've gotten from Revenue is obviously that discussions have been done, they're ongoing, and they won't, or can't say anything more about this. I personally do not see how a construction wage agreement gets reached that would impose union wages on all projects. I think there would either be no agreement or some lesser agreement, but we're all going to have to monitor this and see, and we are following this very closely, as it's of great interest to all involved. As for mandatory inclusionary, Louise, perhaps you can give a description of the program and where it's at this point.
So the mayor campaigned, and part of his campaign was to basically find a way of ensuring that when the city rezones, whether it's through special permit or through a public rezoning, that there be one standard for the housing, the affordable housing produced. So right now we have an inclusionary housing program, which is a voluntary incentive program. And the areas that have been rezoned to include sometimes the option of using that program. And the criticism we've gotten from the public and from electeds was that this is not a consistent way of producing housing for all income ranges in New York. That typically housing produced through our rezonings ends up being market rate housing and doesn't serve various incomes and a range of incomes in New York City. So the mayor got elected, and we spent a year trying to figure out, both with financial consultants and with lots of stakeholders in the city, how to create a program that would not harm development, but that would that would be legal, i.e. that it would be based in a sound land use rationale, which is that when we create opportunities for more housing to be produced, that housing serve a range of incomes. The outcome of our financial study and all of our legal analysis is a program that was certified at DCB on September 21st, and that has been going through the public review process. And the tenets of that program are this, that there will be 3 basic options that would be available when there's a rezoning, either a private rezoning, so a special rezoning brought to us by a developer, or a city area-wide rezoning. And these options would require that either 25% of the total residential floor area be devoted to affordable housing at an average of 60% AMI, or an option 2 of 30% of the residential floor area being available and for affordable housing at an average of 80% AMI, which is about $69,000 for a family of 3. And a third, which is a moderate income option that's not available in community districts 1 to 8, and should only be considered in emerging markets where that market is producing housing currently for moderate income households without city subsidy, a set aside of 30% at an average of 120% AMI. And the way this is intended to work so far is that it is an average. So developers using this program can use a tax credit, basically tax credit subsidy, and provide some units at 60% AMI or below to qualify for the tax credit, but can also produce units at a higher income level, a more moderate income level. In addition, for example, this 421A, which new 421A has income bands. So for example, in option A, there's a 25% requirement for affordable housing units at 60% AMI, and the requirement is broken down into 10% at 40% AMI, 10% at 60, and 5% at 130. So we anticipate that for a mandatory inclusionary housing program to work, that there will be a tax exemption, and we expect that tax exemption to be 421A. So the income averaging is flexible enough so that you could use 421A with either of the options and provide what the 421A requirement is, and still qualify under the mandatory inclusionary housing program. So how can the housing be provided? Well, it has to be permanently affordable. It can be provided on site, meaning in the same building as a market rate unit, or in a separate building on the same zoning lot. It can be provided off-site, meaning it can be provided within the community district or in an adjacent community district within a half mile of the zoning lot that has the mandatory inclusionary housing requirement. There's also an exception for very small developments. So if you have a development of 10 units or less, you're not subject, and you're in a mandatory inclusionary housing area, you're not subject to the program. There's also a financial safety valve for projects that have between 11 and 25 units, that the developer has an option of paying a fee in lieu to the city of providing the affordable housing. That housing can be rental affordable housing, it can be home ownership affordable housing. So for example, if you are a developer and you're deciding whether you want to do rental housing or condos, if the condo market is booming, and you've decided you really don't need 421A because the new 421A does not apply to condos except in very special circumstances, you can still fulfill your mandatory inclusionary requirement by providing for sale units within your condominium or on the same zoning lot in a separate building, or you may provide those units again at another location. Those units, if they were rental affordable housing units as opposed to your market rate units, you'd still be able to qualify the rental units for any tax exemption. In addition, there's no preservation requirement or preservation opportunity to preserve units under the mandatory inclusionary housing program. It's entirely a new construction program. A lot of the misconceptions is that so it's going through the public review process. There is a City Planning Commission hearing on the 16th to decide whether the City Planning Commission will vote to approve the program, and then it goes to the City Council for review and approval. And people believe that if this program is passed, it will become immediately effective. And really all we're doing is putting a policy on the books that may apply to future rezoning. If this policy gets enacted sometime, hopefully in March, it will have no applicability anywhere. When an area is chosen for rezoning, or when a developer brings a proposal to the City Planning Commission to rezone, that's the opportunity for the City Planning Commission to decide whether this is going to be a mandatory inclusionary housing area, or whether the rezoning is going to be subject to the mandatory inclusionary housing proposal. And at that point, each rezoning goes through its own Euler process to determine whether, in fact, the program will be applicable. So there are people who are concerned that communities that don't want this program to be part of their communities, that it will be forced on them, and that's not the case. There are people who are concerned that the EMIs don't go deep enough, and I'm grateful that Daniel said that really, we have subsidies. So to the extent that housing under that program needs subsidy to be feasible,
and I think we will get into some of the balancing, because there will have to be some balancing in that discussion. But let me open this up to Juan and to Justin. When you hear the mandatory inclusionary housing program described, what are your thoughts?
I want to say, first, this is an insanely well thought out plan. This has been years in the making, and Louise and your team, and I'm not just looking to compliment that, but really, this is major work that's going on in the city, and so much energy and good thoughts gone into this. It is scary to hear about as a private developer first. All those concerns which you just addressed really come up before you hear what's going to be happening and how it's going to be rolling out. But it will become, if it's adopted, it will become the new reality. And it's important for people to understand that, because the city is going to continue to rezone, subzone to their needs of creating housing and meeting demand. So, it's the dawn of it, really. And if the council gets their wits together and approves it, which I do hope happens, for you and for the city in general. I think it's a good time because of how well thought out this is, and because of how much energy's gone into it, and how much affordable housing is needed. It's worth trying and seeing how it really rolls out and how successful it can be. And I think it will be very successful, in fact, over time when the private sector really gets great counsel to advise them through the process, and is able to navigate through and make this a harmonious effort.
I mean, I definitely echo, Justin's comments regarding the way that the MIH program was thought out and planned. I mean, it wasn't, we're almost 2 years into the administration, and now the ULURP is in, and that doesn't mean that for 2 years that HPD and city planning were just sitting around. They were trying to figure out how best to do it when talking to the stakeholders. So, personally, I always, seeing the change in the administration, I always knew that, that the old way of doing business was probably not going to be was not going to be what we did anymore. And, fortunately for Justin and myself, we're pretty used to, pivoting and trying to figure out on the fly and trying to understand these programs as they're rolled out and to make sense of them, particularly economic sense of them, and then how to implement them and move them forward. I guess, fortunately or unfortunately, all these programs are subject to public review. And, I think, I was, when I was in graduate school, I was fervent, I think it was planner, at that point, and I graduated with a master's in public administration, so I was a fervent believer in community-based planning. But actually, it's one thing to study it, and it's another thing to see it in action. And, it's land use, and affordable housing and real estate development in general is very technical, very detailed issues, and unfortunately, some of those fine details, and in our business, the devil really is in the details, can get lost in some of the discussions that are had with different stakeholders and stuff. And so, that can lead to outcomes like I think everybody's aware of that, pretty much 90% of the community boards have voted down MIH. And unfortunately, the zoning for quality and affordability, which is really a technical cleanup of the zoning resolution to really not leave floor area and consequently affordable units on the table. So, I really do hope for the best. My experience especially with the city council, has never been that. I heard the council speaker last night on Inside City Hall say that the sort of applications that they are now are probably going to be changed. And in my mind, does that mean that the city council is going to ask for less affordable housing than MIH? Probably not. So, and that's the nature of Bueller, I guess. So we'll see how it shakes out. And I think, Louise is...
In this moment, where there's this public review process going on, where 421A amendment and extension is really subject to this negotiation, how do you look at a site as a for-profit developer, and how do you think about the economics of that?
It's certainly become and been more difficult. I mean, we've been facing this now for how many months, right? So it expired once, it was on the verge, and here we are again, right here at cusp of it. So it's forcing me to invest in popcorn to watch instead of for real estate. But seriously, you have to underwrite deals with a report on being able to pull out of deals. If you can accomplish that with your sellers, which is increasingly difficult over the past 10 years because of massive national which relate to amongst many other people by name and woken up every landowner that exists. But really underwriting full taxes, essentially. You could do that, and also focusing in on other. Me personally, I look at a lot of community facility uses inside my deals, and many developers ignore that FAR. I don't. We have good relations with a lot of community facility tenants and not-for-profit organizations, which we make use of. So I'm focusing in a little bit more on those margins, spending more energy on deals that aren't really market rate, let's say, that's just not addressing that risk. And again, trying to have ripcord inside the deal. You can pull out if I don't like it.
And Juan, are you waiting to see what the construction wage?
I mean, the wage issue is a tough one to grasp. I mean, it's hard to try to make an offer on a piece of property subject to 421A shaking out the way you hope it shakes out. Sellers don't want to hear it. Sellers just want to, get this contract and close, get their, deposit they want the deposit to go hard. Even like 30 days due diligence it's like too much now for a seller. So, it's like, it's difficult, so I'm trying to make as many things conditioned as possible. So what's resulting is I'm losing deals to people that, are willing to take that risk. We're not in the business. My kind of career has not been one of just massive risk taking on upside on the market rate stuff. It's always been very hedged and mitigated with affordable programs, et cetera. So, and a lot of that also has to do with the availability of subsidy and getting the agencies to buy into a project. So, you know, it's tricky. I mean, and with the wage issue, it's just basic math. If the wages go up, the cost of the project go up, and you're trying to pencil something out. I mean, something's got to give. And that developers aren't going to do it for free, so, you know, it's either going to be a land hit or more subsidy or something like that, but that's just basic math.
More subsidy
I
coming?
heard the word subsidy word. Actually, I'm more interested in whether land prices will adjust. Are land prices going to adjust to the new reality of a mandatory inclusionary housing requirement? Are sellers holding fast and waiting to see what happens with 421A rather than adjust their prices? That's something we would like to see. I mean, we've committed over $7 billion to the housing plan, but it certainly isn't enough to give every developer a check.
And the housing plan is really predicated on private development shouldering much of the load properly incentivized.
In response to that, I think the mandatory inclusionary housing program, we calibrated it so that financially it would give the return that developers expect now, so that we would be able to provide the housing without city subsidy in very strong markets. So if land prices don't adjust and there's no 421A, we would have to do a lot of thinking.
Right, because mandatory inclusionary assumes 421A will be there in the form that it is presently passed and hopefully will be implemented.
I mean, you cannot expect your MNO to take a 30%, 40% increase in your deals to work. You know, so, I mean, I think a lot of us expected 421A to change. I don't think anybody thought that what's happening between the state and the city was going to be the determining factor at this point. But, I mean, people had asked me 2 years ago, how do you think 421 is going to change? I said, we'll probably get 25, 30% affordability, which is where we're at. But now you've got this feud really between Albany and City Hall.
That's referring to the insertion into the 421A statute that was signed of language saying that there has to be a construction wage agreement for projects of more than 15 units. Otherwise, the future 421A statute doesn't take effect. So there has to be an agreement by January 16th, or else I think it has to go back to Albany and we have to see. So
I've been hearing city extended. That's what I've been hearing very lately. It's going to be punted for another 6 months while we settle this stuff. So
it could well be what it was last time.
yeah.
So the constant 421A is ending, 421A is extended, 421A is ending, 421A is extended, is causing an absolute strain on the Department of Buildings resources and our resources, while everybody rushes to put a stick in the ground and get a permit before the next 421A is ending conversation. And I'm wondering, I guess, that people who already have land and deals that are ready to go, and so if you don't have land and deals that are ready to go, are you just sitting it out?
Well, probably take a show of hands in the audience. I imagine those who are able to get in the ground do, and those who can't have to wait.
I mean, I was standing on a pile machine on Monday morning. Now it's Wednesday. These guys are really, really active. Now we're going to go place to invest, a couple years back to buy these pile machines because they're getting crazy fees to drive these piles. Really, I've seen prices that are obscenely high just to pull a machine onto the site and drive pile to preserve, to invest before 421A. But there's a lot of that going on around right now, really.
I'm going to pause this part of the discussion and pivot to preservation just because I want to cover a little bit more of the materials. The lion's share of the mayor's plan actually deals with preserving affordable units, and HPD just issued an inclusionary housing preservation term sheet. Louise, what is HPD looking for in the preservation field, inclusionary units?
So So we had, the voluntary program today allows you to provide the affordable units either through new construction, sub-rehab, or preservation. And we had stopped the preservation program for about 3 years because we felt like the bonus ratio for preservation units was not properly calibrated with the construction, new construction bonus, because it's so much more expensive to produce new units as opposed to the scope of work for DU for a preservation project. And if we were going to give the same bonus in the designated areas, 1.25, and close to the same bonus in new construction projects in our 10 areas, we wanted to make the playing field more level. We also didn't want to create a situation where somebody could take an old Mitchell-Lama project with hundreds of thousands of square feet and then flood the market with cheap bonus because they only need maybe $1,000 per DU in scope of work. So we retooled it because we wanted people to be able to use the program to contribute to the mayor's plan. And the way we retooled it is to broaden what preservation is. So it used to just be what scope of work you can do to get the units in shape that they would, the systems would last 30 years, more like J51. And now we say, well, preservation can mean repayment of debt. Preservation can mean rent subsidies. Preservation can mean purchasing land and bringing it into one of our subsidy programs to produce affordable housing, thereby making more opportunities to use the program and also taking away the sort of the disincentive to create mini housing agencies that can sell bonus for $100 million and just park it, basically, because they've preserved a large site that doesn't require much capital investment. What we also did was say, when we look at our term sheets, a 10% developer fee under a preservation term sheet is a reasonable fee. So 90% of the proceeds of the sale of that bonus have to be preserved for that affordable housing site, thereby creating more of a guarantee of long-term permanent affordability that does not require city cash and subsidies 20, 15 years down the road, and also really helps in terms of mission-driven not-for-profits, giving them an ability to have cash on hand that they can use either for the project or, with our approval for other projects.
I think this is a perfect example of really good, solid thinking and work. And really creating a preservation program because it's been handcuffed for years because of the disparity for how much money can really be generated to come into these sites, which is so far in excess for what would need to be done to preserve these units. So how do you reconcile that? And capping the development fee. If I was sitting here wearing my rapacious developer hat and looking back at all the inclusionary deals which have been done in the past 15 years, a lot of people I know would scoff at a 10%, pretty loudly at a 10% profit. And, we made more money than 10% in this business, doing that. But, it's also to bear in mind with this, part of the problem that we have with Inclusionary is these tax payments. Because what Louise and ATV has been facing is these tax payments have been expiring, and these relatively small projects have been really in terrible situations. It's a perfect storm because the council doesn't want to give full tax payments to these projects, what's called in Article 11, and whereas they're not making any money on these buildings, they should have them. It's really collateral damage to a lot of other things, and it's not right. But essentially, I think this is a great stab. And I'm not looking for you fill out cookies here, right? But it really is.
How many projects do you have?
It really is an intelligent way to handle this. I have some questions about it because I was really interested in seeing this. But it will also, for everyone in the room, it will also bring more air rights into the marketplace. And that's something that's carefully thought out part of this plan as well. It will make inclusionary more accessible, I think, as this rolls out. So, we will all benefit on the market rate side from this, and it'll get the city great, lots more units permanently, and that's the point.
I think it's interesting when you talk about the different activities that qualify as preservation. It's not merely preserving a unit through some physical construction work. It's actually a lot broader set of activities to generate these development rights through the inclusionary housing program for use. Another form of preservation is actually baked into the 421A statute that and will take effect is the idea of extended 421A benefits for projects that are 80-20 projects where they were built with 20% of the units already affordable and built before 2008, commenced before 2008. The 421A statute allows those developers, those property owners to maintain the affordability of that 20% affordable component for an additional period of time, add another 5% of the units to become affordable, and in exchange will increase the duration of the tax exemption from 20 or 25 years to 35 years. So that's a significant property tax benefit that's available for the owners of existing multifamily 80-20 projects that's on the books now that will take effect regardless of this construction wage agreement. Can you also preserve those units and get inclusion? Is that possible?
Well, to the extent, anything that doesn't have an inclusionary regulatory agreement right now can apply to us and to the preservation program. One of the requirements, though, is for preservation is that the entire building has to be preserved. So to the extent you have an 80-20, it wouldn't work for inclusionary housing preservation because I most likely this developer would not want to preserve the 80% market rate under this program. But when the way we did preservation before, if you were in a strong market where you could get $400, $500 per square foot, and there were no restrictions on profit making, that might have been a good idea.
There are some restrictions on inclusionary housing that are different from 421A, and wherever there's a conflict, a more restrictive set of requirements will apply. I wanted to ask a question of you, Louise. Does the city have a preference that affordable housing to be rental versus home ownership? Is that there's a little inconsistency between the options in the inclusionary housing program or even the mandatory inclusionary housing program versus the 421A property tax exemption amendment, which basically ends 421A for almost all homeownership projects. I wonder if you have any views on that you could share.
So no, rental deals are much easier to do. Affordable home ownership deals are more complex. As you know, we've done a few with Juan and we've done a few with you. It takes a lot more work to make sure that low-income tenants are able to buy and keep a home ownership unit for a long period of time. Having said that, we don't have a preference. I think the thinking in 421A, especially with the condo market that we have now, which is, the profits that are being made in the condo market is astronomical, that we felt that there was no reason to further subsidize that market with a tax exemption. And in fact, some developers aren't even choosing 421A because they don't need it, because in really high-value markets, they're making enough of a return not to need 421A. So it was really, and the 421A was really saving the city tax, the availability of the tax exemption and saving the city dollars.
Question to throw out to the panel altogether is, the inclusionary housing program allows for affordable units for new construction to be built in the same building in the same community district or within half a mile. 421A, tax exemption required that the affordable units be in the same building at this point. Is there, there's a distinction here, and I guess the question is more, it's a philosophical question about should affordable housing be contained in the same building as market rate housing? Should it be in the same community district? Juan, I know this is something we have kicked around before, maybe talk to this.
I mean, from a market efficiency perspective, the provision of affordable housing units off-site, for a number of reasons, is just more economically feasible, more efficient, less expensive, essentially. So from that perspective, from where my locations are at, that makes a lot of sense, so we should promote that. I was a fan of the 421 certificate program for that reason. Maybe the citywide reach of it was too broad, but the inclusionary to have the community district element, on the other hand, I think as the public housing experience has demonstrated, the concentration of poverty, low incomes may not necessarily produce the best outcomes, right? So mixing incomes, I think has demonstrated, mixing incomes in location-wise has demonstrated good outcomes. But I think there's a balance. I think my philosophy is the development side should be allowed to figure out what's economically most efficient, and then policymakers should help us find a common ground that serves. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all for every community in New York. That's just my personal approach to it. I like to do off-sites because it's efficient. We can get a lot more bang for our buck. Even though it feels like torture sometimes doing off-site stuff.
Off-site meaning 100% affordable.
Yeah, 100% affordable off-site to generate a bonus to I wish the ratio was a little better, but that's a different question.
It really is an interesting question, and I'm not sure there is necessarily a right answer. I mean, it's part of the reason why I want to see a lot of the on-site curve and to see, hopefully I'll be granted enough lifetime to watch it all and see some results. But, just speaking candidly, when we look at off-site developments, we look for the best bang for your buck in the neighborhood, in the district, in the half mile or the same neighborhood. And what that drives you to is the least attractive development site. So, if it's next to whatever it may be, a power source or a garbage source or something like that, that's what you look for because you pay a significantly discounted value. Is that the best model? It's produced some housing, but as the son of a city planner and someone who really wants to see the city just be well, let's say, operate better, I think I'd like to see more on-site. And again, this is through the lens that I was raised dealing with HPD, and I'm not afraid. I have less fear about going through it than other people may. Until that curve, if people are more comfortable with it, I have less fear of going through it essentially. So
for the lawyers, these are two different. So a tax incentive and a zoning, a land use policy are two different things. The legal review and legal scrutiny of those two programs are entirely different. So
they're both at HPD, they're separate departments.
True, and as a matter of law, a state and city and government can create tax policies pretty freely, because it's voluntary, so you don't have to choose 421A. If you want 421A, you can take it, but these are the restrictions that the city believes, and I think most studies say that economies and cities that have a mix of people living around each other produces better better cities, whereas concentrations of poverty leads to crime, etc., and that's just not good for cities. So the tax policy can do that. When you have a land use policy that requires private entities to do certain things, you have to give as much opportunity to those private parties to comply so that you don't get into constitutional challenges, takings, you don't fall into Nolan-Dolan territory of needing a nexus study to impose the land use rationale. So that's why we have off-site.
Right, and that's getting at some of the questions as to whether mandatory inclusionary housing, if it's adopted as an amendment to the New York City zoning resolution, could sustain legal or constitutional challenges, whether it has sufficient opt-out provisions for the small projects or payment in lieu for smaller projects or senior housing or what have you. So that will all come after the issue of whether it's adopted. At this point, I wanted to open it up to see if people have any questions for the panel. It's okay if you don't. Or we can continue.
Dan, I do.
Sure.
Your files are. Oh, sure. I have one more thing. Hi. Hi. Oh. Okay, sure. The bonuses under the new mandatory contract, is it the same bonus structure that existed under the old program? So, or is it, or you get more bonus for FAR?
So there's no bonus.
Oh, there's no bonus at all?
No.
No, but I mean, if you have an area,
I'll explain. So, a rezoning typically means an upzoning. So to the extent that you're being upzoned, that you're going from, let's say, 10 FAR to 12 FAR, you're already getting an increase in your density on the site, and as part of that rezoning, we're saying part of the residential floor area has to serve more than
the rezoning unit itself.
Exactly.
And the mandatory part means you can't build residential unless you make the appropriate percentage of units in a rezoned area permanently affordable under the MIH program. That's the key word, mandatory there. Yes?
Beatrice Sibley, Development. Sorry if I missed part of the discussion. When you use the inclusionary housing, you do the housing off-site, does the off-site housing qualify for the 421A even when used?
The answer is yes. If there's affordable, so if it's 100% affordable, it will automatically qualify for 421A. If it's part of a mixed income development, and that's just who's putting the deal together, if it has the right affordability mix that would qualify that mixed income building for 421A, then yes.
And just to add on to that, if it's an off-site project of sufficient size and sufficient affordability, it might qualify for a different program, the 420C tax exemption, which is a complete tax exemption, or it might get it might even qualify for subsidy programs. But the market rate project that would be in a different building wouldn't qualify for any property tax exemption based on an off-site building, as presently set up. Excuse me. Gary.
Following up on that question, if a for-profit builder can a for-profit builder sponsor an HDFC in a building that's 100% affordable in order to get Article 11 instead of a 421?
It's a bit of a political question.
Now it is,
Let me field this one. For all those folks in the audience that are considering doing an off-site inclusionary housing job where you're either electing, it doesn't work for 421A, but it doesn't work for J51. It's not a tax credit job, so you can't get 420C. I would be very cautious assuming the Article 11 just because you're proposing an affordable housing job. Because
Speaking from experience.
I'm speaking from experience. There are some members of the city council who are actually philosophically opposed to the notion of off-site affordable housing. And so may or may not, despite the fact that they may have voted for it, or the community boards may have voted for it in 2009, will not support it now. And so if you're trying to, don't make that assumption. I made that assumption, and I was wildly corrected late in the game and had to do a lot of pleading and begging, which ultimately resulted in pivoting somewhere else.
I can just add one thing. Yeah, I mean, what HPD is responsibly looking at now, because they've been left holding the bag with these expiring tax payments, is what happens after. Not just looking at a 10-year model and saying, okay, 3.5 times 1 for the offsite generating. It's not, all that money doesn't get thrown into the hard costs and developer profit at this point. There's serious reserves that serious negotiations that are going to occur with all these offsites to really look at the future and make sure that these events don't happen again. So.
Right, and just to clarify the distinction between Article 11 and some of the statutory exemptions, that Article 11 is at the discretion of the City Council with HPD recommendation, but still at the discretion of the City Council, whereas HPD or J51 is a statutory creation. It's an as-of-right tax exemption programs or payment programs. 420C is the same thing. But if you have to go down the Article 11 route, you are at someone's mercy.
Let's just say we won't recommend anything to the council that we know they won't approve.
Yes.
Hi, Jim Bates with Destination Hotel Partners. Quick question on mixed use. This is for everyone. For mixed use opportunities with a hotel component, with a retail component, and an apartment component, let's just say at rate apartment rental program tied into a hotel and a retail market in the secondary or tertiary market, how would this type of incentive be realized with working with some of the elements that you expressed today on strictly residential?
Right, I think I'll try that. In a mixed-use project that has hotel, retail, and residential, the hotel is not going to qualify, obviously, it's not Class A housing. It could qualify for a commercial abatement under the ICAP program if it's a separate condominium unit. It cannot be included in the 421A tax exemption application. Retail space can be included in the 421A tax exemption application up to a certain percentage, and then typically what we do is we condo out the excess, put it in the ICAP if it's eligible. If there's a residential component, then we get into the discussion of if any of the residential is made affordable.
Right, like 15 units or something
Whatever
like that.
amount might be, is it made affordable consistent with the inclusionary housing program to generate a zoning bonus that can be used for additional residential development? Would it qualify for a property tax exemption? It might well, if it's a separate condominium unit from the hotel. So you'd have to put in a certain condominium structure and then discuss what's eligible for what, slice it up to maximize the programs. Then you feed right back into the discussion.
And also a public component, some kind of a public community component.
Right.
Be included in that as well?
Could be in 421A, certainly could be an ICAP, depends where it is located, depends what the use is. There's some very particular details about it and the uses.
Thank you.
Again.
David, my question is for Justin and Juan, which is where so much thought has gone into these programs, but in terms of the increases due to prevailing wage and the increase in affordability components, what neighborhoods do you think this might, given where land prices are and the demand for condominiums, what neighborhoods do you think this might underwrite in?
You're saying
So much of Manhattan, it's simple. You can look at 421, you can talk about it, but the deal is going to be twice as valuable to a condo developer. So no matter how you craft things, it doesn't really underwrite. And so are there, that's happening, I think, in downtown Brooklyn as well. What neighborhoods, given that the program's becoming more difficult than in the past, or, I'm sorry, providing more affordability, possibly higher wages,
well, what higher wages thing is, I mean, I can't even fathom what that would look like truly. And that's like, you know, really, go do something else for a little while or something. I focus on being facility or commercial projects. I really don't know how much time that would take to reconcile the marketplace, but, and we really don't know, you know, what these AMIs are going to look like at the end. You know, it's still going to go back to the council and they're going to chintz at it. There's going to be a lot of amendments and revisions still.
It's a mandatory inclusion.
Yeah. It's a good question. It's a tough question, though. I would say anything that's, Juan, you want to?
Yeah, I agree with Justin. I mean, there's just a lot of uncertainty, particularly with 421A right now. That's going to just lead to a slowdown and you know, people trading on land and consequently production of units. You know, on MIH, you know, unfortunately right now there's also uncertainty on MIH. You know, I'm, based on what I saw last night with the speaker, and her pretty pronounced statement that the applications that they are now, particularly MIH, are going to change. I really don't see them reducing the affordability requirement. With anything, the council, I find the council, frankly, to be very kind of anti-business sometimes. So, you know, I think they'll, you know, 40%, 50%, you know, just to please, because
you're talking about lower income levels and lower taxes.
Well, I'm saying more on, like, so if it's 30% on-site affordability or 30% affordability for rezoning, maybe it becomes 35% because of 40%. Because then the council can say they drove a better bargain. It's a great press release, and you don't really see the consequences until, like Louise said, a year later when there's a rezoning, and then a year after that, somebody's actually trying to do one of us trying to make big projects work, and either wages have significantly gone up, interest rates have moved against us. You know, there's all these factors, you know, which I just wish sometimes that the executive branch could kind of dictate the way that the policies laid out and were administered, as opposed to this kind of situation with the legislative branch that has a huge amount of control over the way the executive branch's policies are carried out.
So last fiscal year 15, we in the Inclusionary, the voluntary program, closed on over 3,000 units, closed more than 40 projects. We did some 80/20s, but a lot of them were privately financed with 421A. So deals are being done, they are being structured. I'm not saying that maybe they're being done on property that had been, some of it's being done on property that has been acquired some time ago, but not all of them. And to date, we have closed in this closing season on over 400 and something units, and most of them are in high density areas. So deals are being done. They're either, some of them are bond deals, so that is still a very good deal for people to have, tax credits and bond financing. And in defense of the council, I'd just like to say I do have a little more faith in this process with the council. We do have a financial analysis that this is based on, and I think that once we get talking and I think people are understanding the financial underpinnings of the program, that there's only so far we can go before everything goes to BSA for a variance, and then you really don't have a mandatory inclusionary housing program. So I think good sense will prevail, and we'll have something we can work with.
That would be incredibly time-consuming if everything had to go through BSA to do that. Just speaking to the question about the scarcity of land and the development sites in Manhattan, I think one thing I've been hearing about is allowing, doing some areas, the expansion of existing properties, perhaps, or the conversion from non-residential to residential as ways to inject new housing in already dense areas. Some of those projects might qualify for 421 or J51 for conversions, depending, but that those might be possibilities if you can't tear it down and rebuild and make it work, and it might also be cost effective. We are at about 9:35 now, and we're 2 minutes over. If there are any other questions? Yes?
I was just wondering, you guys mentioned that mandatory housing may face legal hurdles, and obviously it's already been implemented in a few cities around the country. I was wondering if you're aware of any challenges to mandatory housing programs in the cities.
Yes, there's been litigation all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court on the constitutionality of mandatory inclusionary housing. In New York, obviously it's premature, but there are two types of challenges, two categories we can look to. One is under something called the stat law, which is a state law that says that the state has the authority to regulate rents, more or less, and that changing a city zoning ordinance to require affordability for residential construction might run afoul of that, potentially. That's the rough characterization. The other area is under constitutional arguments, perhaps the takings argument that the economic value of a property might be taken if affordability is mandated as a requirement for constructing a residential property. Obviously, the devil is in the details. What is adopted? How is it applied? For with what options or opt-outs or flexibility? It would all affect how this is viewed on a constitutional level if that all gets to that point. But there are people thinking about this, myself included, and certainly on the city side, it was thought of in the drafting of this policy, and we'll have to see.
A case that just got decided in the Supreme Court. I think it's the Building Association versus the City of San Jose. If I could talk to you afterwards, I think I even have the case in my bag. So I can give you the citation. And they just upheld a program very similar to ours. They went through the same process we did to get a financial analysis done, that they took into account, the input from stakeholders in building the financial analysis, which is just what we did, and the land use rationale on which it's based is that when residential housing is being produced, that the city was requiring that it's for the economic diversity, which is just what we're doing. And the court in that case said that it was, mandatory inclusionary housing ordinances that are based on that kind of land use rationale are not subject to heightened scrutiny, and they're not subject to the nexus Nolan-Doran type of review, but lesser scrutiny of whether it's rational or arbitrary. And so, I'm not the New York City Law Department. They have reviewed this proposal, and I think our lawyers are satisfied that we have a defensible program, but the case out of the California Supreme Court is very timely.
I want to thank Juan, Louise, Justin for being on today's panel and for sharing your expertise with us. It's an exciting time, as you can hear, for real estate in New York, and we will continue to follow 421A, mandatory inclusionary, and the other issues that are of great importance to the real estate community. And we look forward to keeping in touch with all of you about these in New York. Thank you again for participating.
I went to Venable, and then we had during summer, we were doing nice to meet you. He's great. I just like to listen to him because I feel like I've become smart just in his presence. He does, and he's such a nice way about him. He's a sharer. He's great. I'm glad he's teaching in Brooklyn, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah.
is the real